morning to everyone. It's my privilege to address this audience. It seems to me that this is quite sunny today in our Yalta. And that's true, Stephen. After the hard talk, I still survived. And we as a country survived after a number of tremendous challenges my country is facing. I was just yesterday thinking about this action plan. This is the action plan, recovery for Ukraine. That's what needs to be done in a short-term perspective, and this is the summary, what we already did. And I was thinking that, look, in the last 6 months, we passed one revolution, we are still in the state of war, and we got 2 elections. The first one presidential and another snap parliamentary elections. So it's not an easy time. And frankly speaking, the only source of energy, the energy for reforms, the energy for changes, is this strong will of the Ukrainian people, strong desire to have another country. And it was up to the people to make these changes in Ukraine, but much depends on the political elite, much depends on the government, on the House, on the President. Much depends on the institutional capacity of Ukraine to deliver real changes. Just after we took over the office of the Prime Minister, the key factor for us was to resume talks with the IMF. And we did it, we succeeded in getting the IMF and the World Bank support. But on the other hand, this coin has 2 sides. On the other hand, we had to pass a very complicated austerity package, what we did twice. I won't say that people were happy with this, but it was really important that the majority of Ukrainians accepted that the government shut down a number of entitlement programs, accepted that the government had to increase the tariffs for households, accepted that the government had to increase tariffs, taxes and rents, accepted that the living standards dropped substantially. And for today, we need to explain the reason why they accepted this and what should they get after this austerity package, after these tough and complicated reforms. So we succeeded in a number of things. The IMF, partly deregulation. We introduced to the House a number of anti-corruption legislation, de-shadowed partly economy, passed a new procurement law, so did a lot of good governance stuff. But where we failed? We failed really in tackling corruption, in overhauling the entire legislative system, eroded entirely, I would say, eroded judicial system, corrupted judges, ineffective prosecutors, and Soviet-style militia or police. This is I would say, the key agenda for the further reforms in Ukraine. It's not an easy job to handle reforms, having these kind of challenges and having snap parliamentary elections that are scheduled on the 26th of October. Because, politicians are going crazy. Everyone is to promise everything for all good and against everything bad. But this is another, I would say, circle, a political circle that we need to cross, and we will do it. We will do it, and I'm just thinking about the composition of the future parliament and the future government, whether this future will deliver the future. In this action plan that I offered to the Ukrainian people, that the government of Ukraine offered to the Ukrainian people, we clearly unveiled and unfolded what needs to be done in the energy sector, in anti-corruption, in the tax sphere, in the budgetary policy, in the fiscal policy. This is not the final one, and we can present a very long, comprehensive, with 100 pages of some kind of action plan. But what we need a clear-cut strategy that is unfolded in this plan. few challenges still are not on the table, but still are looming. The first and the key one is the war. This government is the wartime government. And let me put it bluntly, we are still in the state of war, and the key aggressor is Russian Federation. And until we get the peace, it would be really difficult to have real changes. Because to change the country, you need to get the support of the Ukrainian people. And this is not normal, this is the key factor. Because the support of the people is the key driver of all reforms. But look, when ordinary Ukrainian citizens switch off the TV set, and for example, the first footage he takes is that Russian tanks invaded Donetsk and Lugansk. And another footage is that, for example, the government proposed some kind of tax reform. It's normal that people don't care about the tax reform. They care about the security. And the normal reaction of every normal human being is to go urgently to the bank and to withdraw the deposit. Then to take hryvnia and to change it into dollar-denominated assets. Fear. So, the key priority, not only for Ukraine, but the key priority for the entire world, is to deter Russia and to stop the war. This is the key precondition for further reforms. It's crystal clear that we are not allowed to waste the time. No. But if we stop the war, if we contain Russia, we will get the chance to attract international investors. Because, you know, not an easy job to attract an international investors when you have in your country already Russian tanks and Russian artillery. To regain the credibility of domestic investors and to be clearly focused on reforms that are needed in the country. So the first challenge, as I already mentioned, is the war. The second one, which is actually a part of the war, because Russia waged the war to Ukraine not only with the military tools and means, but with another one, with the political, economic, even social. So an energy sector. An energy sector is under the threat. And you're well aware that Russia cut off the supply of natural gas to Ukraine a few months ago. And they even went further. A few days ago, Russia substantially decreased the supply of the natural gas to EU member states. It dropped by 10%. And the idea was just to stop the reverse flow that we launched together with a number of EU member states. And I praise and I commend the efforts of the European Commission and our European partners to build up this reverse flow. The sad issue is that a number of Ukrainian coal mines were entirely demolished and dismantled by Russian-led guerrillas. So for today, we are even not out of coal, but we got the problems with the coal supply. Partly, we resolved all these energy challenges. In our gas storage facilities, we get up to 17 billion cubic meters of natural gas. That's not enough to have the warm winter, but this is enough how to go through the winter, not to be freezed. We started to import coal from different countries, including South African Republic. This is the first time in the last 2 decades. And we believe that in case if we restore law and order in these territories that are still controlled by Russian-led terrorists, we will bring back the supply of coal from these areas to Ukrainian electricity system and to Ukrainian electricity plants. So my take on this is that tremendous challenges, huge problems, but huge opportunities. we are obliged. This is our responsibility to deliver, to change the country, and to make Ukraine better. And I strongly believe that in some time we will have European Union conference in Yalta. And you, Steve, will probably manage this conference not with a hard talk, but with easy one.
Well,
Thank you.
I sincerely hope that comes to pass. I guess it's a question of how old we might be by the time we are conducting that conversation.
We are still young.
Yeah, well, tell that to the tops of our heads. But listen, you raised so many interesting issues there. Let me start with a pretty straightforward and simple one. The country, you say, is still in a state of war. The aggressor is the Russian Federation, and Russian troops, you say, are still on your territory backing the men that you call the terrorists. And yet you are now conducting a negotiation with that side, which includes, of course, the Russian government and representatives of the terrorists, as you call them. Outline for me what you see as a lasting, viable settlement as a result of these talks. Because right now it is a very fragile ceasefire. You tell me what you think a deal looks like that can bring lasting peace to your country.
It's too premature to say that we already hammer out the deal. This is the first step to pave the way to a probable or suggested future peaceful solution. And frankly, an idea to have just bilateral relations and bilateral deal with Russians is not the best one, I would say. I am a strong proponent of so-called Geneva format, which includes the United States, the European Union, Ukraine, and Russia. We are not so strong to have bilateral talks and to get bilateral deal with Russians. They will outplay us. That's what they expected, that they want to do. Putin wants to get another frozen conflict and to have his hand in our belly fat.
Would you accept that the Russians have outplayed you so far?
I do remember the interview you had with President Poroshenko, so let me not comment on the international issues.
I'm not even thinking of international issues. I'm wondering whether you would now acknowledge that you, and maybe President Poroshenko too, made a major misjudgment. During the military conflict, through the course of this summer, it seems to me that there came a time when you believed that your forces could impose a military solution. And you misunderstood the degree to which Putin and Russia was never, ever going to allow you to retake Donetsk, Luhansk, and the other key cities that the rebels, the quote-unquote terrorists, held, because Russia's interest would not allow it. You misunderstood what Putin was about.
Well, it's clear for me what is the ultimate goal of President Putin. His aim is not just to take Donetsk and Lugansk. His goal is to take the entire Ukraine. He cannot cope with an idea that Ukraine would be a part of big EU family. He wants to restore the Soviet Union. And President Putin in 2007 in Munich was very clear, saying that the biggest disaster of the last century is the collapse of the Soviet Union. Rephrasing him, so the biggest success of President Putin would be the restoration of the Soviet Union. Russia is a threat to the global order and to the security and stability in the entire Europe. At the first stage, he decided to annex Crimea. At the second one, he wants to build up a frozen conflict in Donetsk and Lugansk. As the third one, he wants to facilitate the corridor from Donetsk, Lugansk to Kherson, Odessa, and Transnistria. And the fourth one, he wants to eliminate Ukraine as an independent country. This is my take on this.
But if you really believe that, then what are you negotiating about? And I come back to this vision of a deal. There can be no deal with a man who is set upon the agenda that you've just outlined.
This is the idea of, as far as I understand, the idea of these talks was just to stop, as President Poroshenko mentioned in your interview, a massacre. Just to get the pause, to regroup, and to get another scope on this situation. So this was the idea of this ceasefire.
I thought it was something else. I mean, you're saying to me, this is simply a pause in the fighting, and in the long run, you hope that with the backing of NATO, and Mr. Poroshenko mentioned arms supplies that he believes will come from NATO member states, you're suggesting to me that the war will resume because there is no other option. I thought that Poroshenko's message was that actually there is a vision inside the Ukrainian government for a settlement that will involve massive decentralization, significant, major autonomy for regions across the east of your country, and a new political deal which Moscow will accept. Is that, or is that not, your vision?
I would be happy to have peace in my country. But the question is the price for this peace. So the idea of having the peaceful solution is a valid one. But to execute and implement this idea, we need to have, sitting at the table, the US and the EU. We need to get some guarantees. I don't want to mention notorious Budapest Memorandum. We already got guarantees. Well, so we need to have an appropriate guarantees of Ukrainian sovereignty and independence.
You mean, sorry to interrupt, but this is so important, you mean the sorts of collective and mutual security guarantees that would come with NATO membership. So you're saying, frankly, Ukraine cannot make a deal with Russia unless it has its territorial integrity, its security guaranteed by the West. Is that what you're saying? Is that why you've chosen to raise this idea that Ukraine must seek NATO membership?
Well, let me comment on NATO. I kept silence on NATO, and the answer on NATO was usually that NATO is not yet on our radars.
That's what you said to me a few months ago.
Yeah. But as Russians invaded and made an explicit incursion into Ukrainian territory, there is no reason to play this card. So the idea is to say it bluntly and clearly that NATO, in these particular circumstances, is the only vehicle how to protect and defend Ukraine. I do understand that not all NATO members were happy with this kind of statement. But my job is to make happy the people of Ukraine. This is the first point. The second one, I do understand that in a short-term perspective, NATO is not ready to accept Ukraine. But, you know, ask and you will be given.
Not necessarily.
Well, it's about Bible. And knock and the door will be opened. So we decided to knock.
But you just said something very interesting. You said, my job is to make the people of Ukraine happy. It is not in the long run going to make the people of Ukraine happy if you stake out political positions that are frankly unrealistic. And some people may believe that you've begun to play politics with this issue. You are sounding, if I may say so, more hawkish than President Poroshenko. And some Ukrainians may believe that's because you're staking out territory in the run-up to the October elections. Is that what you're doing?
You know, I am doing what I believe in. In 2008, as the Speaker of the House, I signed an application to NATO asking for the membership action plan. I stick to my previous promises. It was 7 years ago. And actually, President Poroshenko supported it. And he, answering your question, he said that this was the decision of the National Security Council. Am I right? That's what he answered.
Yeah, he did.
So we have a strong unity between the President and the Prime Minister. This is my answer.
Well, your tone and his are not the same. I'm sure you know that. And it is such a delicate moment, both in terms of the ceasefire and how you move forward with some sort of a dialogue with Russia, and domestically, given the elections coming and all of the internal political challenges that you face, such a delicate moment that I wonder whether you risk destabilizing the situation with some of the comments, not least about Putin and his agenda, but also about NATO. You could destabilize the situation.
The only person who destabilized the situation is President Putin. And I can hardly imagine what kind of another red lines he can cross. So he already crossed all possible and impossible red lines. He did what we never expected. That's what you said, that sometimes you can anticipate, but this won't happen. No one anticipated that Russia will start the war in Ukraine. It happened.
Well, is that really true? I mean, are you not guilty of a major misjudgment over this summer? I mean, was it really so surprising that Putin did what he had to do in terms of troop deployments to ensure that your forces did not take Donetsk and Lugansk? Was that so surprising? Should you not say to the Ukrainian people, we made a major mistake? They know it. The Ukrainian people know that you got that wrong.
So you believe that we had to surrender and give up? No, to no avail and never. And we will fight for our country, for our independence.
So, just to be clear then, because again, these are important words. When Poroshenko says to me, Stephen, there is categorically no military solution for our country, do you agree or disagree?
Well, having the fight with the nuclear state, it's not an easy job to find just military solution. But what we have on the table, a complex solution, a complex one, including military. So diplomatic efforts, sanctions, and military operation.
I asked him about his reaction to the international response to the crisis here. He was very diplomatic. I wonder if you're inclined to be a little more forthright with me. How would you characterize the West, Europe, and the United States' response to the crisis so far?
Well, yesterday I got very bad news that the revenues of Russian Gazprom dropped by 40%. And the US imposed sanctions on Gazprom. So my answer is that, look, the West did a lot. Putin's idea was to split the unity among EU member states and to split the unity between the US and the EU. And at the certain period of time, I was thinking even that he succeeded. But no. He failed. Values, EU values, and values of freedom and democracy are much stronger than Russian tanks and artillery and his autocratic regime. So, the EU and US passed a number of sanctions, and the last round of sanctions that imposed on Russia, it seems to me that this is the real threat to the Russian economy, the real one. Yes, we would be happy to get lethal, non-lethal weapon, more military cooperation. One can say that we would be happy to have a strong military support. And that's where West wasn't extremely cooperative due to a number of issues, because the West doesn't want to wage the Third World War. This is the idea which is hovering around all Western capitals. So my take on this is that one can say that Russia doesn't care about sanctions. This is bluff. If you froze an assets, if you secure an access to rollovers, if you stop to finance a number of energy projects in Russia, Russia is not definitely in the best economic shape. It's more in the West economic shape. And if oil goes down, this would severely affect the Russian economy. The idea of sanctions is to deter Russia, to bring them back to real negotiations, and to sign and execute and implement the real peace plan and peace deal.
A final question from me, and then I'm going to open it up. And it's about Ukraine's internal situation. You rightly said, you know, the challenge our country faces and our ability to shape our own future isn't just about what happens in the East. It's about grasping the need for these fundamental reforms. And you said, very frankly, you said, we have failed in tackling corruption. We have failed with genuine reform of our political system, our totally eroded judicial system. You're very honest about the fundamental weaknesses that Ukraine has today. If I were a Ukrainian watching the electoral process today, which is it October 26th, is going to end in parliamentary elections, why should I have any faith that the political parties on offer, the politicians on offer in Ukraine today have any capability, willingness, intent to really take on these weaknesses inside your own country?
I can tell only about my political position and myself. I did what I can and what was possible. And I will do everything for this country until the last day being in politics.
Do you honestly think the next parliament is going to be capable of the fundamental reforms that you say are the only way for Ukraine to get out of this?
I honestly think that this is the last chance for my country. And we will use this chance. And it's all within the political will of the president, of new government, and new parliament. But again, if the president and the government will not meet the expectation of Ukrainian people, we will have the new president, the new government, and the new parliament.
But the very fact that there are, what is it, dozens of political parties, that even you and the president frankly can't agree to fight on the same political ticket, suggests to me that many of the old factionalisms, divisions, personal egos, vanities and animosities are still undermining Ukraine's political system.
Well, the idea was to run together with the president, but I cannot tarnish the party with the name party of President Poroshenko. So we decided to go in separate camps, but together as a one united front for reforms and front for changes.
Is that all you're saying on that? All right, I'm going to open it up. I think there'll be lots of questions, so I'll try to be really short with the questions, and if you would, Prime Minister, well, you are good at giving very succinct answers, so we'll just start down here and we'll go through as many as we can.
You are much better.
Good morning, Marek Siwiec. Actually, your last question, in some sense, I want to continue. Question about the internal situation in Ukraine, and the question is about the reason of post-Maidan destruction. Because we have seen you, Tyahnybok and Klitschko playing together. And then Yulia Tymoshenko came from prison. At this moment, you have your party, Klitschko has his party, President Poroshenko, who has never his party, has his party again with Lutsenko. We have the miracle that the Party of Region disappeared. Well, okay, we can like Party of Regions or we don't have to like the Party of Region. But they represented a certain number of people, not only in Lugansk and Donetsk, but it was a significant power. Now they do not exist anymore. We have free Party of Region or post-region, post-Party of Region. So my question is, what is the idea for the pro-reform coalition? If you cannot communicate before election, how can you communicate after election? I'm really afraid that if I see names in the name of personality of leaders, in the name of parties, this is the barricade for the future cooperation, not something which can improve cooperation. This
okay.
It was my question, but one short comment, because I'm sitting with Javier Solana, and we can say something about how to be a member of the NATO. Javier was those time the Secretary General of NATO. I was National Security Advisor for Poland. It took us to think in a realistic way 6 years to apply, to go to American Senate and say, listen guys, we are not bringing problems, we are bringing benefits as a future NATO member. And believe me, I see a discussion about the NATO membership in Ukraine now as a technical and very, let's say, egoistic. And it will not work. Thank you.
Okay, so there's really two questions there. There's one about his concerns about the nature of party politics in Ukraine today, not serving the best interests of the country. And the other question, if we briefly get into it, is that he thinks, frankly, getting distracted by the NATO discussion right now is not, is that fair? Not in the best interests of...
Thank you for translation.
Yeah, good. So if you can, briefly deal with both.
Let me put it bluntly. I personally did everything I can to run together with the president. But there are some complications. So there is one party which has no personal name in its label, which is People's Front. And I had to do it urgently to establish the party and to run. Otherwise, you know, if you're out of politics, so how can you deliver what you promised already? And this is frankly not the best solution. It's far from the good one. On the other hand, look, this is the democracy. But before the elections, it seems to me that it would be reasonable to sign the coalition deal. I am not extremely, well, I would even say I am skeptical, frankly, about the future parliamentary elections. Because we will be running on this similar legislative basis with no changes, with the same state of play, having a number of well-known, notorious players. But on the other hand, people of Ukraine, they claim, they urge us for the snap parliamentary elections. So we will pass this and we will overcome this. On NATO, I already commented this. I do understand that NATO is not ready to accept us. But to become the NATO member, we need to start this process. Let's move. Let's move.
Okay. All right, sir, we'll get to you.
Charles Grant from the Centre for European Reform in London. We heard from President Barroso last night that a deal has been struck between Ukraine, Russia and the EU to delay the implementation of the famous DCFTA so that it will not be implemented on the Ukrainian side. Surely this takes away the pressure on you guys to reform your economy, which is one of the purposes of the DCFTA. Why have you done this, which seems to be very much in Russia's interests? And is the Maidan going to be happy about suspending the DCFTA?
What I got from Brussels, and I've seen the statement of Trilateral Commission, As far as I understand, there is no delay in ratification. The deal will be definitely ratified. This is the first one. The second one, after we ratify the deal, Ukrainian side will implement everything that's what's in the deal. We will approximate all Ukrainian legislation up to the EU standards, and the government is ready to pass an implementation action plan resolution. So we will not wait. The third issue is that my feeling is that this was the good gesture of the European Union. As we got this grace period, the EU opened its market, and Ukraine is still protected with a relatively protective import duties. So, for Ukraine, this is not the bad deal. We are allowed to export to the European Union, to EU member states, but we have a number of defensive and protective measures not to open entirely Ukrainian market for the EU goods. We will gain more. So this is the grace period for Ukrainian economy.
But the question was whether that allows you to go easy on the reform side.
No. To no avail. No. Just next day, the House ratifies the deal. The government and the president will implement every single word from this deal.
All right. I'm going to try and squeeze in a couple more questions. Ma'am, did you want to ask a question? Yeah.
Olga Bogomolets, professor of medicine, ex-candidate for presidential elections. The main statement, which I understood from your report, is that the cause of why you didn't make any reforms to the country since you're running for the last 6 months is the war with Russia. Is it correct? The war is the thing which is not giving you possibility to make reforms in Ukraine. Is it correct?
Well, not going into details, I would be happy if you just get...
Use the... Arseniy, put the mic close to your mouth.
Yeah. If you just get this recovery plan, and at the second stage, we enlisted everything what we did. We did a lot in this country in the last 6 months. But the key impediment for further reforms is 2 elections, one of which you participated in, presidential one. The key factor is the war. And yesterday, actually, President of Estonia, he was very clear, saying in his opening remarks, saying that no chances to have reforms, and I can hardly imagine and hardly remind any successful attempt to have reforms in the country that it is a stage of war. So the war is the problem, a huge one.
I would just like to make one more note, that in Ukraine we will never have peace. War with Russia is not the cause of what's going on. We have civil conflict, and you're not talking about it. All people who were coming to Maidan, they were coming there not to bring you or other parliamentarians to the government. The people want changes. The first enemy which we have is corruption in the country, and it's still there. Nothing changes since 6 months. New government is running the country. So we will never have peace in Ukraine if you will not make reforms, and you don't have time anymore. Thank you.
I mean, it is just it is interesting to me that you've had 6 months in office, and yet you say to me today, you know, I forget the precise phrase, but you basically said we have completely failed in tackling reform. I mean, that is, frankly, very depressing. That you have been Prime Minister, admittedly in an extraordinarily difficult period, but you see the country still riddled with corruption today?
First, you mentioned a civil conflict. We do not have a civil conflict in Ukraine. That's what Russians are usually saying, that this is the civil war, this is the civil conflict. No, this is the war that Russia waged. Second, in the last 6 months, I know that you are running in the presidential list. The Prime Minister was in office for 6 months, the President was in office for 3 months. We did what we can, starting with an austerity, starting with the IMF, starting with the number of reforms in tax and budgetary system, and ending with the second stage of visa liberalization regime. I can hardly imagine that in these circumstances it was possible to do more. The country is in a very complicated position. And what is needed for the country? A strong unity among everyone. And I believe that the next parliament, together with the next government and the president, will make better reforms than the current one. And I wish to see this.
Right, we're going to have to move really fast now because we've got about 5 minutes left. Sir, you at the back, and then we'll come over here, and then over there, and then I think we'll be out of time. Just tap the mic. There you go.
Tomáš Fiala from Dragon Capital and European Business Association. Prime Minister, we very much support your efforts in solving the security situation and balancing the budget or stabilizing the fiscal situation. But I have to, on behalf of business and the European Business Association and also many economists, including Nobel Prize laureates and Eric Bergloff from the EBRD, etc., we are very unhappy with the pace of fighting corruption, deregulation, rule of law and administrative reform. We have discussed it with you 6 months ago, and it seems to me that you have been afraid about the social impact. A certain level of populism maybe has been present in your decision making. You will be Prime Minister for 2 more months, maybe longer after the elections in the new government. We would very much hope that a person like you would go down in history as somebody who has actually at least started some of the structural reforms. Could you please, in the next 2 months, deregulate, eradicate some of the authorities that are there just to extract bribes, solve the issues that, for instance, the Estonian president addressed to you, where the largest Estonian investor has been defrauded of his $200 million investment in Kiev. Is it possible, or do we have to continue to wait?
Okay. Well, it's the same theme, but I suspect you're going to give the same answer. But just, I mean, it is interesting the groundswell of opinion we're hearing, which says, you know, we are very disappointed with what we have seen on the reform front.
What we did, you know that the Parliament passed a legislation that reduced the number of licenses from 1984 to 93. So this was the first step. Today in the morning, the government published the resolution. We eliminated actually about 50% of different controlling agencies and different controlling offices that were in place in the Ukrainian government. So this is the second step. The third step, that we introduced to the Parliament a new tax code which reduces the number of taxes from 22 to 9. We will propose to the Parliament to pass the legislation which entirely revises the income tax and personal profit tax. So we abolished all controls and all checks by a number of Ukrainian authorities under the new legislation by the end of this year. So we are moving forward.
Ladies and gentlemen, I with my eyes have promised a couple more questions, but unfortunately I do know that Prime Minister Yatsenyuk has a meeting, a rather important meeting that he has to get to, and we promised we'd be over by 10:15, and we've overrun a little bit already, and I thank the Prime Minister for allowing the questions to continue. But unfortunately, we are going to have to draw this session to a close simply because the Prime Minister has to move on to his next appointment. Prime Minister, I really thank you, not just for your opening remarks and painting a picture of where you see the country right now, but for taking so many tough and challenging questions from me and the audience as well. It's been great to hear your views on where the country is. I look forward to fulfilling our date at some point in the future in Yalta itself. But for now, let me, on behalf of everybody, thank you very much for being here today. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Stephen. Well, tough questions, tough job, tough times, but bright future. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.